large schools of thought in the China of the 6th and 5th centuries, and just a very terribly oversimplified idea of what values they represent. Oh, a nice piece of chalk.
Yes, I got it out. I couldn't stand you
God
using those
bless
little
you.
tiny little bits. The old teacher in me, I couldn't take it.
Now this is sort of leftist to rightist. Over here we have Mohism. I don't know whether that's left or right, but Mohism is all about love.
Ooh, okay.
Over here at the far right, we have legalism. And legalism is all about law enforcement. And in between those, I'm not quite sure where to place them, are the ones who we're most interested in, Taoism and Confucianism. So let's put altruistic love. I'm not going to say much about Mohism, but the Taoists and the Confucians were very much affected by it. So we kind of say a little. Mohism is pretty religious. It does consider love to be at the basis of all things. And its prescription is for unqualified altruistic love. Now, altruistic love means not only not giving yourself preference, but neither do you give preference to your family or your state or your anything else that's kind of close to you. So it's international, universal altruistic love. You should love everybody as equally as possible as the circumstances allow. Taoism we'll be talking about for a while today, so we'll quote it. Confucianism is about trained virtue. So Confucianism wants to produce a certain kind of person. That person will be characterized by certain virtues that we talked about last time, and that requires training, education, exemplification, modeling. Legalism is about enforced law. Enforced law how? Enforced mainly by a penal code. There are many sticks in legalism and there are not many carrots. So the legalist position is everyone must follow the same law, and if you don't, you're going to regret it. So very punitive, very heavy policing. It's a police state that it envisions. And of course the question arises, well, you know, who's in charge here and why is he in charge? I mean, it's got to be somebody who independently arrives at what the laws should be and then makes everybody else do them. That, not surprisingly, comes about by circumstance and force. Somebody moves in with resources. For example, the main legalist dynasty was the Qin dynasty, the dynasty that made China as we know it now, the dynasty that built the Great Wall, and a dynasty that was able to get there by things like developing metallurgy, developing cavalry tactics and things like that, you know, military expertise. Taoism will be tricky. There's no easy formula for Taoism, but let me call it something like humble naturalness. And these points of view to some extent merge with one another, to some extent compete with one another. I would say ultimately we're in relatively modern China, Confucianism triumphed, but it was Confucianism that had absorbed a significant amount of Taoism, a little bit of Mohism, quite a bit of legalism, and also Buddhism. So it's very much a modified Confucianism. And that modified Confucianism is what's being pushed now in China. As you may know, there have been 80 or more Confucian institutes created by the government of China in the United States. So they are to encourage the study of Chinese language, that's kind of included always, elementary Chinese, but also Chinese values, then those Chinese values are identified with Confucian values. Which means that Confucianism is back in the ideology, political ideology of China. We are all, if we're Chinese, we're Confucian. But what Confucian means, of course, can be adjusted to circumstances. That was not the case, in 1947, and it's become the case again much more recently. We've seen some Confucianism. Let's take a look at Taoism and see how much time we have left. And Taoism is associated with a guy called Lao Tzu, and a book called the Tao Te Ching. Lao Tzu means kind of, sometimes translated sort of the old guy, the old teacher, or something like that, the old master. He may or may not have existed. He may be a mythical creation. He may be a real guy. But it doesn't really matter too much anymore. The Tao Te Ching is a book attributed to Lao Tzu and associated with a narrative about how it came about. Once upon a time, girls and boys, there was an old guy, very wise man, who hung around and tried to teach sense to the Chinese. He was kind of a cracker barrel philosopher. He turned up at inns and at street corners and things like that and gave his little talks, and everybody bought him a drink and he would talk longer then. And he was greatly respected and greatly revered and greatly loved. But one day, at the western border of what was then China, what was then the Eastern Zhou dynasty, the border guard looked up and he saw an old guy riding on a water buffalo coming down the road towards him. And it was the first business of the day, so he gets up to check passports, so whatever you did at that time. And as he comes into view, he sees that guy on the water buffalo is Lao Tzu. And he says, "Master Lao Tzu, why are you coming to me at the border?" He says, "I'm going beyond the border. I'm going off into the wild western regions, and I'm never coming back." And the border guard is heartbroken. He said, we love you here, we esteem you here. He said, "But you pay no attention to me here." He said, "You all like my teachings, nobody follows them. So I'm going out where things are unspoiled, you would say wild, you would say barbarous, I would say fresh. And that will be the end of me as far as you're concerned." Well, the border guard then says, "But please, don't go. I'm going." "Well, if you must go, then please leave us some record of your teachings so that we can meditate on them in the years to come." And he says, "Okay, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm going to park my water buffalo right over there, and I'm going to sit down in the shade of my water buffalo, and I'm going to write a few things down for you. And when it gets too hot, when the sun comes up on the other side of the water buffalo, I'm going to stop and get back on that water buffalo and go down the road. So that's what happens. He sits there and he writes what is now known as the Tao Te Ching. The Tao, remember, De means power, particularly spiritual, moral power, and this is just joining the way and its power. Now, what Tao is will come up in what we're saying. So the Tao Te Ching is explained mythically, probably that way. We have it. It's a kind of an enjoyable book to read, but it's a very puzzling book to read. It's interpreted in innumerable different ways because it is so obscure and ambiguous. But it has definitely lasted. What is the idea of the Tao, first of all? The Tao is an ancient Chinese concept, used by Confucius, used by everybody. It's not originated by Lao Tzu. The Tao is, the word means the way, and it can be applied simply to, what's the way from here to Kenner or something like that. But it also means the way of life, and it means the way of the universe. And it also means the source of the way of the universe. So there is underlying it a kind of cosmology that regards a power that sets everything in motion and directs it on its course. And we won't go into the cosmological thing, but in the Tao Te Ching itself, you find references to the creation narrative. It's not creation in our sense. Underlying everything is the Tao. The Tao gives rise to Tai Chi, which is now thought of as kinds of exercises that you do, but it meant, the breath of life. And out of Tai Chi comes two complementary principles, the yin and the yang. And out of the union of the yin and the yang come water, heaven, and earth. And out of them come what is always referred to in the literature as the myriad creatures. In other words, all the stuff, everything that we think of as the components of the created world. Now, the Taoist emphasis is on following the Tao, finding out what the Tao is for you and going that way. To betray the Tao is to go your own way, and you can. You can diverge from the Tao, and that's what screws things up. Nature follows the Tao because it can't help it. And that suggests that, a possible translation of the Tao is nature, if you consider nature as ultimate, nature originating everything. So all the, the birds and the bees and all are following their Tao, and we could follow our Tao, but we keep diverging. How do we diverge? Well, by exploiting nature, damming the rivers. The river knows where it's supposed to go, but we decide we want to do something else with it, so we put in a dam. Now you can see in that the beginning of, why do so many environmentalists love the Tao Te Ching? Because not screwing up the environment is part of and they would never call it the environment. It's not our home. It's something we share with the birds and the bees and the, the bugs and the bunnies and everything else. You can get a sense of that if you see Taoist painting. There is some Taoist painting, I think, at our museum. Taoists were big into art. And in Taoist, there's a whole Taoist treatise called landscape painting. And if you look at Taoist landscape paintings, you notice a couple of things. First of all, they're all about nature. You will not find, a barn in the foreground or a car going by or anything else like that. They're all about nature. There are almost always mountains and declivities in them, way ups and way downs. And there are creatures in them, including plants and animals, And among those animals is likely to be a human being. And the human being will never be any more prominent in the painting than a deer or a bunny or anything else. Just one of the residents. Never, you know, the man in the foreground kind of standing on the hill mastering nature. No. He's part of nature. He moves in and he behaves himself. So the human beings in Taoist paintings are always very integrated with nature, integrated with the environment. They're at home there and they're not bothering anything. What is the person like who follows the Tao? The person who follows the Tao will be characterized by what is called Wu Wei, which literally means doing nothing. Literally it means doing nothing. Figuratively and philosophically, it means not messing around, not interfering, not reshaping nature to your own tastes and so on. Fitting in, easing yourself in to the universe you occupy, and remaining an easy to get along with resident of that environment. Since it's written in poetry and in very figurative poetry, you know, you can't really reduce it to abstract language particularly. But there are symbols in it that are used again and again. One is the symbolism of water. Why is water an important symbol to Taoists? Because water seeks its own level. Water knows where to go, gravity tells it, and that's where it goes. So be like water, know where you're supposed to go, and go there and relax when you get there. Another one is emptiness in a funny sense. It's like, what they mean by emptiness is like they say, what is the most important thing about a jar? Not the sides, but the emptiness inside. Now, obviously, the emptiness inside is confined by the jar, but that's what you really care about. That space inside where you put your millet or you put whatever you want. Yeah. So the empty spaces are symbolic of what you should be. You should be an empty space and be able to be filled up by reality, by authentic experience. Low places are also very favored by Taoists. You'll find references to ravines and declivities and pits and caves and canyons and things. They're good. And they are destined to grow and the mountains are destined to shrink. And that's also kind of a clue, you know, be humble, be lowly. And again, the phrase fit in always occurs to me. It's not one they use, but that is the idea. Fit in and don't push anything around. Fit in gently. Now, this obviously leads to practical conclusions about what kind of life you're going to lead. If you were a thoroughgoing Taoist, there are obviously a number of occupations you would not even consider. You certainly would not be, an engineer who is messing around with the environment. You certainly would not be a military anything, because military is all about messing around and not fitting in, making somebody else fit in. But what does that leave you to do? It leads you either to lead a simple life in which you cultivate some stuff to eat and eat it and try to make it fit in with the environment around it, sort of the organic farmer kind of approach to things. It's very open to the arts. All the arts are characteristic Taoist pursuits. The Taoists have been very big in the arts, painting particularly. Because again, you're absorbing and you're transmitting and you're not messing around. You're not chopping down the mountain, you're making a picture of it. So remember the Confucian arts of peace, that would come into this very much. The things that don't involve violence, that don't involve encroachment, that don't involve radical transformation of reality. Now, because it is esteemed for its language, let me just read you a few bits from it. These are from the at the very beginning of it tells you you're not going to get it. The Tao that can be told of is not the eternal and real Tao. So it's ineffable. It's transcendent. The name that can be named for it is not an eternal name, and nameless. It is the origin of heaven and earth and water. Nameable, it is the mother of all things. So it's ultimacy in that sense. That's the Tao, the big Tao behind all the little Taos. All the little Taos going to stream forth from it. Some just a little piece of advice. Always refrain from celebrating the worthy, so that the people will not scheme and contend seeking notoriety. So celebrity status is bad stuff. Refrain from prizing rare possessions, no status symbols, because otherwise the people will seek to steal. Refrain from displaying the objects of desire, so that the people's hearts will not be disturbed. So that's the status symbols again. Don't show what a nice thing you have, because you will, I don't have one. Here's another. These are totally disjoined. There's no continuity in it. The highest good is like water. Water benefits all things generously and is without strife. We know water can be pretty strifeful. It dwells in the lowly places that men disdain. Thus it comes very close to the Tao. The highest good loves the lowly earth for its dwelling. It loves the profound in its heart. It loves humanity and friendship. It cultivates sincerity in speech, order in government, effectiveness in deeds, timeliness in action, and since it is without strife, it is without reproach. So this again is kind of close to Confucius in the, government is by influence and example, not by force. To beget, to nourish, to beget but not to claim, to achieve but not to cherish, to be leader but not master, this is virtue. Now, the Taoists are dubious about the Confucianists. They think the Confucianists started out okay, but then they got so formalistic that they turned into a rigid system of, kind of like a military school, that sort of thing. Everybody's got to do it this way, and that way you'll all be nice people. Taoism is all the way at the opposite pole. It was when the great Tao declined that there appeared humanity and righteousness. Now remember, those are English renderings of Confucian virtues, and they're used a little sardonically here. It was when knowledge and intelligence arose, again Confucian virtues, that there appeared so much hypocrisy.
Wow.
And that has always been the charge of Confucianism. If you have this ideal way to be, you'll pretend to be that way, whether you are or not. Kind of like political correctness. I'm really lustful, but I present myself as chaste. I'm really proud, but I present myself as humble, and so on. About political spin kind of thing. It was when the six relations lost their harmony that there was talk of filial piety and paternal affection. So we talk about them now because they really were breaking down. We talk it up while it breaks down. It was when the country fell into chaos and confusion that there was so much talk about loyalty and trustworthiness. So it's kind of an accusation of lip service and formalism replacing, the real stuff. So you have to read these words like humanity and righteousness, which sound fine, and they were fine for the Confucians, but they became Confucian jargon. So if I were doing the translation, I'd put them in inverted commas or something, or italics. Banish sageliness, discard wisdom. Again, this is obviously sardonic. And then the people will be benefited 100-fold. Banish humanity, discard righteousness. And that does not mean become inhumane or become unrighteous. It means stop the fussing about it. And the people will return to real filial piety and real paternal affection. Banish your skill and discard your profit, and the thieves and robbers will diminish. See the simple, embrace primitivity, reduce the self, lessen the desires. Now in some of that, I think you could see why Taoism was so hospitable to Buddhism. I mean, Buddhism is very much in the same direction. Buddhism arrived in China in the beginning of the Common Era, around first decade AD or CE, and it made friends with Taoism very quickly. Now this is about the Tao, the ultimate transcendent Tao. There was something nebulous and yet complete, born long before heaven or earth, silent and empty, self-sufficient and unchanging, resolving without cease and without fail, which acts as the mother of our world. So it's the nearest it comes to a kind of creation myth. He who knows the masculine, yang, but keeps to the feminine, becomes the depth of the world. Being the depth of the world, he will dwell in constant real virtue. There is a very, very strong preference for what the Taoists consider as feminine qualities as distinct from masculine qualities. And by masculine qualities, they mean the kind of, pushiness, aggressiveness, remake things and so on. Whereas their image of the woman is one who nurtures, who preserves, who makes things kind of peaceful and livable in. And if we were all doing that, we'd all be better off than building up the army. So as I say, it's become, the Tao Te Ching is often quoted by feminists who don't really know much about it, because it does not play at all into modern Western feminism. It's not calling for the female CEO or the female president or the female general or anything like that. The idea is rather that females are sensible enough not to want to be presidents, not to want to be generals, and not to want to be CEOs. Tao invariably does nothing, Wu Wei, and yet there is nothing that it does not do. And that kind of paradox runs all through it. Tao gave birth to one, one gave birth to two, two gave birth to three, three gave birth to all the myriad things. The one is the ultimate Tao. The one it gives birth to is Tai Chi. The two that are given birth to are yin and yang, and the water, heaven, and earth are the three, and the myriad things are everything. So it's a little encapsulation of that view of origins. It always seems to happen. Men of violence come to violent ends. To give life and support life, but not to own. To achieve, but not to cherish too much. To lead, but never to master. This is virtue. And I think you begin to see the quality of life that's sought here. Of all things yielding and weak in the world, none is more so than water. But for attacking what is unyielding and strong, nothing is superior to water. Nothing can take its place. So that's the other side of it. The image of the earth is an image of what water has done. Water seeks its own level, and in seeking its own level, it shapes the universe. So it is yielding and it is powerful. Okay, yeah, you have sort of a feel for the Taoist thing there. Now let's, since we didn't do it before, let's read a few pieces from the Analects of Confucius.
Let me ask one question.
Sure.
Is there a Taoist, there are Taoist priests and temples, and
that's a good question.
Do?
Taoism, the Taoism we're reading about, the early Taoism of Tao Te Ching, no. Who needs it, basically, is the idea. But later on, there came a distinction between what's called, now they call this philosophical Taoism, the original Taoism, and it's strictly philosophical. Then spiritual Taoism, and spiritual Taoism becomes more and more magically oriented, seeks immortality, and develops temples and priesthood and the whole religious paraphernalia. And not surprisingly, that became the popular Taoism, kind of everybody gets it. This is subtle. I mean, this is not obviously something you can, give a talk on to a hall with 10,000 people and have everybody go out satisfied. What the hell is he talking about?
Are there images in the temple, some kind of images of?
There are images, but, there are, some of them have statuary with Lao Tzu in them, but they're more likely to have images of yin and yang and things like that, symbolic images. The painting tradition, the landscape painting and all of that tends to come out of philosophical Taoism. You don't get any divine anything in those paintings. And there is no divine anything, it is the Tao. And it's, in that sense, it's a kind of pantheism, but it's a pantheism that originates in a power, a driving force, which is represented as being there just fine and then doing these things and producing what we think of as the creation. So if you want to, I think, when we personify nature, Mother Nature and things like that, I think you kind of getting kind of close to it there. Nature doing things, not nature just, there it is, being there. Okay, now these are Confucian passages, and I just take fairly representative ones. Confucius put a lot of stock in education. By nature, men are fairly alike. It is learning and practice that will set them apart. Now, he meant that both ways. You can mess them up by the kind of training you give them, or you can improve them. So they're kind of a given, and what happens in the acculturation process is what will make them what they are in adult life. In education, there must be no class distinctions. That's Confucius. It sounds sort of modern, or would be modern. When it comes to acquiring perfect virtue, a man should not defer to anyone, even to his own teacher. He has things about, member deferring to authority figures is big in Confucianism. And he says the student who finds that his teacher is teaching something contrary to his principles should speak up very, very politely. And if he gets nowhere, shut up and hang on to your principles and ignore the teacher. This one has gotten a lot of commentary. Learning without thinking is labor lost. Thinking without learning is perilous. So you gotta have both. Just kind of random thinking, what's the point? It's gotta get somewhere. On the other hand, don't jump the gun, think the thing through. And then it should be part of a learning process. A young man's duty is to be filial to his parents at home, respectful to his elders abroad, circumspect and truthful, and while overflowing with love for all men, that sounds, men here is the generic thing, to associate himself with humanity. Humanity meaning humaneness, not people, but humaneness. This is one of his disciples. Zhenzu replied, "Our master's teaching is simply this: loyalty and reciprocity." Then Zukung asked, "Is there any one word that can serve as a principle for the conduct of life?" Confucius said, "Yes, certainly. The word reciprocity, meaning do not do to any others what you would not want others to do to you."
Golden rule.
The Junzi, how does the Junzi behave? Behave when away from home as though you were in the presence of an important guest. Deal with the commonest people as though you were officiating at an important sacrifice. So deal with common people reverently, respectfully.
They ought to say that to all the people who come here from Mardi Gras. Misbehave. Which they wouldn't do at home.
And he appends to that again, do not do to others what you would not want others to do to you. The humane man, desiring to be established himself, always seeks to establish others. So, okay, it's obvious. Desiring himself to succeed, he will always help others succeed. To judge others by what one knows of oneself is the best way to achieve humaneness. Now again, it's this reference from the self to others. I know how I'd like to be treated, so I can make a pretty good guess about how you might like to be treated. He asked about virtues by good old Du Chang, who asked a lot of questions here. He wants to know what virtues he would most emphasize. Confucius said, courtesy, magnanimity, trustworthy good faith, diligence, and always kindness. Someone inquired, what do you think of requiting injury with kindness? And that would be a Mohist thing. Confucius said in reply, how then will you requite kindness? Requite injury with justice, kindness with kindness. Not bad. Riches and honor are what every man desires, but if they can be obtained only by transgressing the right way, that's the Tao, although this is Confucius, they must never be held. So in this, it's, very much a categorical imperative sort of approach. It's perfectly fine to try to prosper, but if you can only prosper by being immoral, settle for not prospering. Poverty and lowliness are what every man detests, but if they can be avoided only by transgressing the right way, they simply must not be evaded. Now, it's a rather high moral code. Nowadays, a filial son is just a man who keeps his parents in food and shelter. But even dogs and horses are given food and shelter. If there is no feeling of reverence and companionship, where is the difference?
Oh, good.
A son may gently remonstrate with them, the elders. If he sees that they are not inclined to follow his suggestion, he should resume his reverential attitude, but he should never abandon his own purpose. So hang on to your principles, but be polite. Here. Zulu asked about the worship of ghosts and spirits. Confucius said, "We don't really know yet how even to serve our fellow men. How can we know about serving spirits?" Well, what about death was the next question. Confucius said, "We don't know very much about life. How can we know anything about death?" This is probably a response to Taoists. When nature exceeds art, you have the rustic. When art exceeds nature, you have the clerk. It is only when art and nature are harmoniously blended that you have a real gentleman. Confucius said, "You may be able to carry off from a whole army as commander-in-chief, its commander-in-chief, but you cannot deprive the humblest individual of his free will." Again, a very modern way of thinking, very like Enlightenment thought. So Gong asked about the gentleman. This is always the Junzi translated gentleman here. Confucius said, "The gentleman first practices what he preaches, and only then preaches what he practices."
Unlike Confucius. It's a smart old cookie.
So you're glad the Chinese have readopted it?
Yes.
Confucius said, "The gentleman reaches upward, the inferior man always goes downward."
That's true.
What was that thing we got from Michelle Obama recently? Yeah, when they go down, you go up. It's a very similar. Low ground, high ground. Confucius said, "The gentleman is always calm and at ease. The inferior man is always worried about his appearance and full of distress that he may not be making the right impression." Confucius said, "The gentleman understands what is right. The inferior man understands what is profitable." That's kind of neat. Confucius said, "The gentleman cherishes virtue, the inferior man cherishes his possessions."
He cherishes what?
His possessions.
Oh.
Possessions. The gentleman makes demands on himself. The inferior man makes demands only on others. The gentleman always seeks to enable people to succeed in what is good, but never helps them in what is wrong. The gentleman is always broad-minded and never partisan or discriminatory. The inferior man is always partisan and discriminatory and is never broad-minded. The political side of it, if a ruler himself is upright, people will go without orders. But if he himself is not upright, even though he gives orders, they will not be obeyed. Lead the people by laws and regulate them by penalties. This is obviously addressed to the legalists. And the people will try in everything to keep out of jail, but they will have no sense of shame. Lead the people by virtue and restrain them by the rules of decorum and patiently, and the people will have a sense of shame and a sense of virtue and will achieve goodness. He was opposed to capital punishment. Okay, so you should have some sense of the flavor of Confucianism and Taoism. And you can see that the criticism of Taoism is the stuff that I read to you right now from Confucius is, it is pretty admirable. But you can see how it is open to hypocrisy. If you're steeped in these rules of decorum, well, I can go through the motions, without it going very deep. And that was what Taoism thought was happening. That superficial Confucian behavior had replaced deep Confucian values. And then he went to the other extreme, just, cool it and relax. And now in modern China, there are the religions that are recognized by the state do not include Confucianism, because Confucianism is not considered a religion. Confucianism is held in high esteem now. That began with Dao Xiping, when he, remember in 2015, when he came to this country, he began by saying, we need a cultural revolution in China, and it must be based on Confucius. And then even during his speeches here, little Confucian tidbits kept coming in. Now every student in China must study Confucianism, and but of course it's all they're all state textbooks, so the harmony between Confucianism and the state is always emphasized. The three religions: Buddhism, Taoism, and there are four religions for China. Buddhism, Taoism, Catholicism, and Protestantism. So they make a distinction between Protestantism and Catholicism, and they tend to be very distrustful of Catholicism because of the Pope, the claim of the infallibility of the Pope. They say this is professing supreme allegiance to some other guy who lives in another country and considers himself to know it all. So Catholics are watched very closely. Catholic churches exist in China. You could go to a Catholic church in China, but they're very closely disciplined. You certainly will not hear any provocative words spoken by a priest in China, and they're subject to the authority of the state. And that presented a lot of difficulties for the Vatican, because for the Vatican, bishops and priests are subject to their authority. And there were arguments about, well, should we just disown them, or should we kind of say that's okay? They decided, I think wisely, to say nothing, that we can't do anything about this. There is Catholicism there. It is satisfying a need. We can't change the situation. So just shut up and let it take its course. And that's the way it is now.
Are the priests in Catholicism, are they, how do they get to be priests? Does the state make them priests?
No, there are a couple of leftover bishops. Yeah, there are a couple of stray bishops who ordain priests.
Okay.
Yeah, Catholic bishops in China. And it is possible to get a bishop in there, from outside. If he gets made a bishop in Rome, say, that would be the easiest way to do it, and then comes there, just asking for a visa and not presenting any problem, they would have no objection to that. If all he's going to do is ordain people to be priests, if they don't like the priests, then they're not going to function.
Does it flourish with younger people building it up, the church?
No, it's more the old Catholic.
Whatever's
Catholic
there
family.
is there.
Yeah, yeah. Buddhism came to China, as I say, in the beginning of the Common Era. Christianity came to China in the form of the Jesuits in the 16th century. That's a long time. So for 16 centuries, you had Buddhism very active there, and Christianity unknown, except Marco Polo told them there was such a thing, and so on. It was just a curiosity out there somewhere. After that, Christianity flourished somewhat here and there, particularly in the south, in the what became the more Portuguese trading area of China. But it never took off big. There was never big Christianity in China. And Protestantism, of course, came very late. Protestantism was not a missionary religion for a long time after the Reformation. And by the time it became one, it was much more interested in missions to our continent than to China. And only probably 19th century, there were efforts to evangelize China by Protestants, but they were never big. But the Chinese are more comfortable with Protestants because the Protestants don't have this allegiance to somebody they tell them is infallible. That infallible thing really bothers them a lot. That sounds to them like this guy was godly, and that means that people who have allegiance to him will subordinate allegiance to the state, to that. What else do we need to say here? Mohism is very religious. Mohism maintains that altruistic love is the ultimate solution of everything. And I mean, in a way it is. I mean, if you push it just conceptually, everybody treats everybody else as an equal. But it sounds like a pretty good world, but there's no possibility of that happening for a number of reasons, some of them being that people are unequal, they're morally equal, but they're unequal in many other respects. There are people to whom you have obvious responsibilities because you're their parents or something like that. And so Mohism always has difficulty with the practical side of it. I mean, that thing often comes up. If you have saved up enough money to send your kid to school and your neighbor has not, if altruistic love require you to share the money with your neighbor and neither of them can go to school. That's the kind of dilemma that's posed for the Mohists. Underlying Mohism, however, is something that transcends these practicalities. It is that God is love. It sounds very much like the fourth gospel in that sense. That the ultimate reality is love, and we participate in that ultimate reality to the extent that we behave lovingly. And the only way that you can know you're behaving really lovingly is if you love others like as yourself. They also develop things like loving your enemies is the real test, because they are the most unlovable of your acquaintances. And by love, they like Christianity, it does not mean anything emotional or cuddly. It means treating them the way you would want to be treated yourself, considering their interests as valid and valuable as your interests. Legalism took control of China in the Qin dynasty. This is another one of those spellings that will puzzle you. there is a that dynasty which we are now talking about, and there is a this dynasty which we are now talking about. So it's that little break. This is Qin. That's Qin. And to make things more complicated, this is also sometimes rendered Qin, pronounced, of course, Qin. The Qin dynasty was a legalist dynasty. It accomplished a great deal, and it accomplished it basically the way successful fascist governments accomplish things. So it made everybody do what the government wanted, which included building the Great Wall of China, with slave labor, obviously, but also with building good roads and improving the irrigation system, and a lot of infrastructure improvement done again by forced labor. So at the same time, it was a military power, and the same military resources that had enabled it to take over Eastern Zhou enabled it to take over everything else. And that is why this is the beginning of China as we know it. It extended the dynasty to an empire, including all of what we think of today as China. And that's why China is called China, from not Qin, but Qin. It collapsed in, what year did it collapse in? It collapsed in 206. So it didn't last very long. I didn't see when it began. (221 to 206), and tremendous accomplishments during that short period of time. But also, from the way I've described it, you can see terrible unrest. I mean, people were boiling with anger at the government. And the government's response to that was just, more guns and then more police and so on. It finally exploded in 206, and the Qin rulers could no longer keep control. And it was replaced by the Han dynasty. Actually pronounced Han. And the Han dynasty immediately adopted Confucian principles and introduced Confucius into education and so on, and modeled itself essentially on Confucian values. And the Han dynasty, which came in right after the Qin dynasty in 205, so there were a couple of intervening years, and maybe 202. But it lasted for 400 years. And the Han dynasty was a Confucian dynasty. So 400 years of Confucian indoctrination made this sink very, very deep into the culture. This is 400 years of Confucianism. Compare that with the length of our own country's life. Subsequently, there was a dynasty that favored Buddhism. There was a dynasty that favored Taoism, but always they came back to Confucianism. And the Han dynasty was interrupted after 400 years and then returned again about a century later. So you have the later Han dynasty, again, strongly Confucian. And with that, all kinds of requirements being put in, like all civil service examinations included serious examination, your knowledge of Confucius, the Confucian values, the Confucian philosophy, and so on. So you had to be a Confucian to get anywhere in the Han dynasty. And they're not going back to that now, but they're moving in that direction now. Where every kid's exams are going to have a few questions about Confucianism on them, and civil service exams will also. So How that will work, it's interesting also that they consider it exportable. You know, these Confucian institutes.